We represent agribusinesses in the United Kingdom. We were formed 20 years ago as an amalgamation of other trade bodies. We have about 230 members, and we represent the animal feed, crop protection, fertiliser, grain trading and seed sectors of the United Kingdom. We run a number of assurance schemes as well, and our offer, if you like, to our government is that we can represent the whole supply chain and multiple businesses in one organisation. We're based in central England, but we have offices in Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland. Agriculture is a matter for regional government in the UK, and that's why we're structured in this way. We are, however, very much a member of our European-based associations. That is extremely important to us, despite EU exit. The exchange of information in both directions between the UK and the rest of our European partners, I would argue, is more important now than ever. Not only so in the EU, you know what we're doing in the UK, and vice versa. We're a member of VII-a on the animal feed side, COSRAL for grain trading, and like AISR, we're members of Euroseeds as well. Our role is very simple. We lobby the UK government, we shape policy at the highest level, we inform our own members and other trade associations too, we provide trade assurance schemes, and we offer training and advice to our members. A little bit about me, my background was actually starting in the House of Commons. My first office was about there, which sounds very nice, sounds very enjoyable. However, when you consider that this would go off every hour, it makes for quite a noisy working environment. So that's where I started. I managed a farm estate in England, a very traditional English farm estate, and my current role now leads me to work with lobbying, government, I lead on cross-sector policy for our members. We have an election next year, so you never know, things can change, but especially in the last year, much like in the rest of the EU, food security has really written up a political agenda, and so our interactions with government, as you can see, have increased as a result of that. I also have another interest, as you've heard, from a family farm in eastern England, so an area called Suffolk, which is sort of the breadbasket, if you like, of the UK, a bit like the Malaysia, I suppose, of the UK, only much smaller. We're a mixed cereal farm. We run a number of conservation and environmental schemes as well. We're engaged in a number of research trials on soil quality and water quality. We have very heavy clay soils, so managing our soils is extremely important. One big challenge for our business is that since EU exit, we will be phasing out in England basic payments. So direct support is being phased out, and the last payments will be made in 2027. This is a big challenge for our business. We have to work out how can we retain our productivity in light of this removal of direct support. And fundamentally, we cannot provide these public goods if our productivity is not high. We can only provide one with the other. I went back to our farming archives when Alina asked me to be here today, and I thought it was fascinating to go on the journey of where our family farm has been. For a long time, we were reliant on these punch horses, which drove agriculture in our region. They were the driving force of agriculture up until the very recent time. So important was it? It's been immortalised on the badge of my beloved Ipswich town. That's how important it is to our local region. But when you look back in hindsight, it's obvious where the progression goes. That was my grandfather's first tractor on the left, and the progression is very clear since then. And going through the archives, it really made it a lot clearer. This is our own personal journey of how we progressed. That's my grandfather. Very nice air-conditioned can that we have in the top right. But fundamentally, we're doing the same thing. We're producing goods, food, or we're providing bedding for animals, fibre, fuel, whatever it might be. It's just the way in which we're doing it is having to change. And the ways in which we're doing it are changing with them. And I'm fascinated as to how we will look at our agricultural practices in 50 years' time, reflecting on the present day. What is it that we would look back on, like we're looking back on agriculture there today? And I personally feel that plant breeding is one of the areas that we would look back on and wonder why we did not engage sooner in biotechnology is when we have the available science to us. The backdrop is very clear. We know, for example, that particularly in the UK, yields are largely plateauing, and we have to look at where do we get our productivity gains from. This image was from our national food strategy. The dark orange shows how reliant we are on a small area of land in the UK for our food production. We get a third of our calories from the dark orange section of the map. So in the UK, we have a pretty limited land mass, particularly in productive land. We have a high population, 69 million, and so land use has become a really important issue. We've got to maximise the outputs from the limited land that we have available. So the first issue is, I can see from diverse parts, is the diversification of cropping. That's for us as AIC, one of our big challenges. At the moment, we're seeing a real limitation on the number of crops, but the variation of crops being grown by UK farmers. We're very reliant on two crops in particular, wheat and barley. We need more of a rotation, sustainable soils for meeting our markets, for other benefits as well, agronomically. And the real challenge is how can we increase this part of the chart so that we've got a more broad and diverse rotation. It's a challenge for our farmers as well. And plant breeding clearly has a part to play in that. We'll hear a lot more from experts about the other potential benefits from the environmental perspective, and that is the second key area as well. Drought tolerance, minimising inputs, maximising outputs at the same time. And the third area in particular is in demand, consumer demand. Not just consumers, but also livestock. We know that livestock rations and requirements in the animal feed sector is changing all the time. We've got a huge drive in the industry from food companies who want to reduce soya import reliance. That high protein, particularly among gastric sectors, has to come from somewhere in order to meet that. We've also got changing dynamics in domestic consumer demand as well. We're seeing quite a significant increase in allergies in the UK, and we have to look at how we, as food producers from the start of the food chain, can address that. We know consumers are changing their diets for a number of reasons. Plant-based meals is becoming more, is being pushed out a lot more in the UK. And the challenge for producers in the UK is, can we help meet that demand, or are we going to allow the consumers to continue to consume but import the goods from elsewhere? Let us try and meet the demand that's clearly shifting within the consumer profile. And so with those in mind, that leads us to the Genetic Technology Precision Breeding Act 2023. I'll refer to it as precision breeding because that is the term that we are using for it in the UK. But gene editing, precision breeding, language is a really important part of this, and particularly our government, as we in industry refer to it as precision breeding. It was consulted upon in April 2021. The bill was introduced before Parliament in April 2022, and it was brought into law by the King, signed into law in March of 2023 this year. We anticipate, and we hope that it will be implemented fully by the end of next year, 2024. So, as we heard, quite ahead of the potential NGT proposals in the EU. There is a good reason for that, which I will go into. These slides have been provided to me by the UK government. I thought it would be interesting and important that you see how our government rationalise and explain the legislation. You're all welcome to the slides, I should say, as well. So there is quite a lot of detail on there for you to take away. The most important thing that the government has led with is the environment. That is the key driver in the way it's communicated on the legislation for driving precision breeding as legislation. Food security is the other as well, but that is where the public particularly and wider society were interested. We also have a very world-leading research base in the UK that can really move precision breeding forward. 2 years ago when we were consulting, EU exit obviously was still ongoing, and we were looking, certainly it was clearly a potential opportunity for the UK at that time. Obviously I deal with a lot of other EU exit related issues in my day-to-day, but this was one area we could certainly look at to try and have a more positive approach. The definition of precision breeding is quite concise, and that is for those goods, particularly technologies produce plant or animal with genetic changes that could be arisen through traditional processes. So these are changes that could have arisen within the existing gene pool. It's very important to say there are no limitations, no 20 limits, none of that at all. We have an advisory committee on releases to the environment, a long-established expert committee that will decide on all applications on a case-by-case basis. And that's very positive that we have science-based, objective decision-making when the application process happens. Other key policy or key changes within the legislation is that it will be completely separate to the GMO regime. So it's completely apart from it and then separate to it. There will be 2 notification systems, one for research purposes. That's already in place and has been implemented. We have 9 research projects on precision breeding that are already in place. Very interesting projects that are going through. The second is that there will be a marketing notification that we're busy speaking to governments about, and that's what I'm in government next week talking to them about how that will work in practice. And thirdly, it's important to stress that this legislation also covers livestock. So livestock is included within the Act. What I will say is that the government are going to prioritise the implementation of plants first and then livestock later, instead of trying to do it all at once. In terms of the next steps, we expect what we call statutory instruments to be laid early next year. This is the final implementation of the regulation, if you like. And as I mentioned earlier, we hope that, in fact, we were advised that yesterday, in fact, that the legislation should be in place and operational by the end of next year. One of the reasons for that is that we're very likely to have a general election probably at the end of next year. So there is a time pressure on government to do that, which is quite positive that we've got a time pressure to work towards. There's a clear role for our Food Standards Agency to regulate any applications for precision breeding. We will also have a national list of plant breeding, which we have already in conventional agriculture. And this plant breeding, precision breeding, will be included within that as conventional. We also have a number of expert working groups that have been established that I sit on, particularly for the whole supply chain, because that's going to be extremely important, having the whole supply chain brought into this, so that end markets, food companies, retailers are included within all of this process. And it's not just a plant breeding project, it has to be the whole supply chain, so it is actionable in practice. This is in draft, I should stress, but this is the proposed framework for how our Food Standards Agency will authorise and assess precision bred goods. The most important thing I think to take from it is that we will have a 2-tiered system as well, most likely. Although it's important to note that Tier 1 and Tier 2 are still within the precision bred definition. The difference between Tier 1 and Tier 2 will be simply that Tier 2 will be those products that will be fundamentally changed in their composition. So fortified with nutritional improvements, enhanced products, for example, anything that might change the physical composition, if you like, whereas Tier 1 is likely to be drought tolerance products, for example. That's where the likely change will happen. The FSA published its board paper yesterday on how this will work. Very interesting from a regulatory point of view. It's a lot more pragmatic and proportionate than we had anticipated. There is no risk assessment for Tier 1 goods, and it's a simple notification process only. From the perspective of the AIC, as you can imagine, we strongly support the legislation. We think this is absolutely the right time to move on this, given the combination of challenges in our food system. How the approval process is extremely important. What the FSA told us is positive, but we will look at that very closely. We do, however, have to think about EU market access. The EU is our biggest market in both directions, and we can't operate completely in isolation. We have to understand and consider how both regulatory systems could hopefully interact with one another. As I mentioned, the entire supply chain needs to be included, and maybe our last big challenge is actually a UK one, and that's the UK internal market. So that at the moment, the legislation is relevant only to England. Scotland and Wales have not followed suit and have not supported the legislation yet. Traditionally, they have a policy of dynamic alignment with the EU. However, now that the EU has introduced the NGT proposal, that changes things. It leaves them with a choice of aligning with the EU's proposals, aligning with England's proposals, or doing nothing and being left behind completely. Obviously, we would hope that they will come in to the same regulatory regime as England, our members who trade around the UK, clearly it's a lot more simple for them. And these are some graphs that explain the challenge that we have within the internal markets when we have to create potential internal trade barriers, especially in bulk products, commodities like cereals, which of course are traded and mixed and co-mingled throughout the supply chain. I get asked a lot of questions by EU stakeholders about the process we've been through, and so I'll try and preempt some of them now. The first is, what was the process like going through the legislation? It was actually very positive overall. We had very, very little by way of negative campaigns. All political parties were supportive. The only difference of opinion was actually on the implementation rather than the principle of precision breeding as a concept. The main opposition, if you can call it that, was to actually the livestock provisions as opposed to the plant-based side. And that was because we made it so clear that it was linked to the environment and food security. The other key stakeholder in this, farmers. Farming groups were very well supported, and they were very supportive, and they remain supportive of the legislation. And that's really important. We know that farming advocacy is extremely important so that the wider supply chain and consumers have trust in the process, and they remain supportive. The farming unions in Scotland and Wales are lobbying their governments to be brought into the same regime as England. They don't want to be left behind. Labelling, there is no labelling requirements in the Act at all. The only labelling provisions that may be introduced are those that would be required anyway under novel foods, say if you're labelling for allergen-free precision-bred organisms, for example, anything that's a health claim, that's under the existing legislation, but there is no labelling specifically to precision-bred products. And this is part of the reason why. This is another graph I put together to explain, particularly in bulk goods, how difficult that could be. From our point of view, labelling requires segregation, and segregation means considerable cost. And we don't want to be in a position where we're having to create just niche products only. This is something that we want to have a solution for all of agriculture for. We need to be very clear on tier 1 to tier 2, clearly. We need in the supply chain to understand where the differences are so that the supply chain has confidence. And my last, I suppose, bit of advice is just we have to focus on the outcomes. Those 3 big objectives that I mentioned earlier on, we have to keep coming back to them. We have to take the public with us, we have to take politicians with us, and remember why we're doing what we're doing. And with that, I thank you very much for your time, information, and I look forward to your questions.